My name is Karolyn Smardz Frost. I'm an archaeologist and historian, and I'm an author, and I teach part-time at Atkinson College at York University. I wrote a book called I've Got a Home in Glory Land, A Lost Tale of the Underground Railroad. It's the story of Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, fugitive slaves from Kentucky whose 1831 escape from their Louisville owners made history. I've Got a Home in Glory Land is actually the first entirely original fugitive slave biography to be written since the Civil War. I've Got a Home in Glory Land offers a love story, a history story, and 20 years of intensive research on the heritage of African Americans who came to Canada and became African Canadians. It took me 20 years of my life to do this research. I worked during that time, but this was every holiday, every weekend, every dime I had went to doing research on the Blackburns. I would spend months at a time in Kentucky. That journey from obscurity to visibility, I think, is one that I set up in a way, and the reason I wanted the book to be published too, was to provide a model for other researchers to say, this can be done. To not have that story told is a loss to all of us. I want to find out how many other stories we can still tell by piecing them together that way, by finding the tiniest clues, by using a multidisciplinary approach to heritage research. Because I started out as an archaeologist. I went back to university and did a PhD, which I finished when I was 47, in order to do a better job on this book. I started out as an archaeologist and a classicist, which is not a tremendously good education for writing a book on African Canadian and African American history. Thornton's mother was born in 1776. Thornton's wife died in Toronto in 1895. That is 120 years of race history on both sides of the long border that Canada shares with the United States, and it's an awful lot of places to make mistakes. I wanted to get it right so I could do honor to the Blackburns, set the bar very high as I could for excellence in research, so that I could prove this could be done. And I think I have proven that, and done it in a way that people actually want to read. When I first started doing Black history research, African Canadian and African American, I didn't know what I was doing. And I will tell you that actually doing fugitive slave research and trying to trace people back in slavery is not something that is easily done by anyone. There is no template for this. The reason for that is because the people who kept the records of slavery were the slaveholders, white people, who had an interest in their slaves as property. And one of the forms of psychological dominance which pervaded the slave system, was one of the ways of keeping people down, was they never addressed by their slaves by a last name. If they thought their enslaved people had a last name at all, they believed it was their own. Well, by the time people got from Virginia to Kentucky, they'd been sold 3 times, they'd been given away to a married daughter who ended up the property of her husband, they'd been raffled off in lotteries, for God's sake, which really happened. So their names often, their surnames often bore no relation at all to their owners. Well, but the records of Thornton and Lucy Blackburn were Thornton, good with horses, age 19. In the records of slaveholding families that followed the westward movement, the records were found in 13 American states as well as all over Ontario. And some of it's from family records, some of it's from things as prosaic as tax rolls. The thing that I did first, which is sort of an archaeology thing, because I didn't know what I was doing, so I did what an archaeologist would do, is I went to the places where Thornton and Lucy had been. And I looked for the land where they had lived, because that's what archaeologists do, they look at place. That turned out to be an extremely effective way of coming to understand people in a slave condition, because they were property and often were recorded in land records. Sometimes slaves were sold along with the farm, just like the serfs of Russia were. Also, they would be mortgaged, they could be hired out to another owner. All of these records tend to show up in the property records, land records. Wills and deeds, of course. The other thing that's really, really useful is inventories of estates, because in all of the southern slave states, what there was in every slaveholder's estate documents in the probate was a thing called the division of slaves. Just like you divided up his inventory of his household goods or her household goods, the slaves were divided up amongst the heirs, with no regard to their own family conditions at all. I mean, husbands were given away and wives went the other way, and sometimes miles and miles apart. Sometimes the wife would be going with a married daughter who's going out west to Kentucky from Virginia and knew she would never see her husband again. These things happened to people, real people. Children were taken away and given, oh, well, we need something worth $50. Here's a baby. And it was almost that casual. The other thing that was tremendously important for me always is court records. If there is a court case, you've got eyewitnesses. In the case of Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, when they escaped on the steamboat captain did not know they were fugitive slaves. But he was prosecuted, and the boat owners were prosecuted in a court case that lasted 15 years and went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. There are boxes of accounts, and eyewitness accounts and affidavits, and the most interesting thing I find about it, Mrs. Blackburn was a very beautiful woman, and she was 9 years her husband's senior. He was 19, she was 28, and she was dressed in a very fine silk gown, carried herself in a very gentle manner, very refined woman. She'd grown up in the household. And nobody could remember all these eyewitness accounts were given by men, the purser of the ship, the captain of the ship. They couldn't remember what Thornton looked like. They described her in absolute detail, down to the cut of her coat. She was really very impressive. And the thing that struck me most about it, I had the ship's log. And the captain, in his own hand, wrote in who his passengers were. And he said, Thornton Blackburn and lady, surely an unusual way, even for a free black woman, to be described on the borders of the slave South in 1830. When I discovered the tombstone in Toronto's Necropolis Cemetery that said Thornton Blackburn had been born in Maysville, the newspaper article from 1888 that said he'd started the first cab in Toronto, and then in the death records at the cemetery it said that he was born in the United States, didn't give where, but his tombstone said Maysville, Kentucky. His mother's death record, the woman from whom he'd been sold away at the age of 3, is buried in Toronto. It said Virginia. That's the only clue I had to her origins. This is detective work par excellence. I mean, I'm an archaeologist anyway, so I like to find little bits of clues and put them all together. It took me 16 years to find Sibby Blackburn. There is one Sibby connected to the name Blackburn, connected to someone who moved out to Kentucky who was named Smith. And that was Thornton Blackburn's owner when he was born, was Smith, William Smith. That's all that exists in the records of colonial Virginia, and I'm pretty sure I got all of them. Well, okay, maybe not all of them, but a great many of the documents that were at least the least bit relevant. It's almost like this was meant, because whenever I got discouraged in the research, something would happen. There's one memorable occasion. I was driving down a country road in Kentucky, in a different county from where the Blackburns had lived. I was trying to find the sons of Thornton Blackburn's owners. I'd never been able to figure out which sons were which. Thornton Blackburn was owned by a Smith and then by a Brown, which is why the research took 20 years. Trying to find the genealogy was complicated. But I stopped in a churchyard to have a sandwich because there were no rest stops or restaurants on that county. It was out in the middle of nowhere. Stopped in this little churchyard, a little New Highland Baptist cemetery. And I went and sat on the bottom of a fallen over tombstone, and I sat down with my sandwich and I looked up, and there was John Brown, Richard Anderson Brown, Clayton Talbot Brown. They were the kids of Thornton Blackburn's owners' tombstones in front of me. What are the odds? But there were a lot of coincidences, a whole string of coincidences that encouraged me, made me want to feel I had to move forward. And the very last one I'd like to just give you is really exciting. It's connected to Toronto. When I got the money from the Ontario money, the lottery money, to do the dig, the fellow who was the grants officer was a man by the name of Jay Jackson at the Ministry of Culture, and Jay Jackson was a rhythm and blues singer in Toronto with his sister Sean Jackson. They were quite well known. They are quite well known now. And I said to him, you wouldn't be descended from any Jacksons in old Toronto, because there was an Anne Maria Jackson and her son Richard Jackson buried in the family plot with Thornton and Lucy Blackburn. I never could figure out who they were. He said, you know, I had a great uncle Thornton Jackson. I thought, oh, what are the odds of this, right? But he won't talk to anybody. He's 93 and he's kind of curmudgeonly. He won't talk to anybody, so I don't think he'll help you. Well, I tried to talk to Thornton Jackson, but he wouldn't talk to me. About 4 years ago, so 16 or 17 years into the research, I started trying to figure out who Anne Maria Jackson was in this grave, and I found her. She was a slave in Delaware, and her 2 oldest boys were sold away. Her husband lost his mind out of grief, and she walked out of Delaware with 7 children, ages 5 to 17. And they got to Toronto with the help of some of the Underground Railroad operators in Philadelphia. She probably stayed with the Blackburns when she first arrived in the city, because I don't know whether it was hers or whatever, but there were a bunch of children's toys all in the right archaeological layers to be the 1859, 1860, 1861. And they billeted other people too, so somebody's children left toys behind. Well, she went and lived in one of their rental houses that they rented out for $10 a year to successive years of fugitive slave families, so people would have a place to live. They owned 6 houses that they did this with. And she stayed friends with them all her life. She passed away and is buried in a family grave. Well, it turns out Jay and Sean Jackson are direct descendants of Anne Maria Jackson. We reconnected. I told them the family story, and I actually knew what Anne Maria's husband's name was because I found her in Delaware, and they never knew what their great-great-great-grandfather's name was. So this was a very emotional moment. We were all crying around the kitchen table. And my publisher stood up at my book launch at St. Lawrence Hall last February and said, Karolyn doesn't know this, but my wife is Susan Swan, who is the writer, a very famous author, and he's Patrick Crean from Thomas Allen Books. And he said, my wife and I purchased a house on Brunswick Avenue 6 years ago, which was the home of Thornton Jackson. So he's publishing my book, he's living in a Jackson house, and there were 25 members of the Jackson family in the audience at my book launch. And Jay and Sean Jackson sang for me, and they did, do Lord, do remember me, I've got a home in glory land that outshines the sun, and there was 150 people singing and crying that day. It was remarkable. I wanted to prove that we could find the stories of the individual people from the past whose tales are very often forgotten. You know, the people who built the buildings in Toronto, put the bricks and mortar together in Canada, weren't the rich, famous, or the military. They're not the people whose letters and diaries end up in the archives. They were ordinary people just like me, my family, your family, the family of many of the people in the audience. People who came here, tried to build a new life for their kids, worked 3 jobs to keep their kids in school, bought their first house in a tough neighborhood perhaps so that they could get a foothold, did a little bit better. Those are the people whose heritage built our country and North America. It's an immigrant heritage. And their stories, unless those people got into trouble or did something amazing, one or the other, and ended up in the newspapers, we don't know their names. Worse, we don't know the names of the enslaved African Americans. The records of slavery were kept by slaveholders. Often there was one time they wrote it down, that was in a family Bible or a legal document or a sale document or a will. How many buildings burned down in the Civil War? There were probably 1 million African Americans lived, worked all their lives, and died, and there is no record even of their names. That horrifies me. I'm not a particularly esoteric historian. I always rather expected that the book would have a very practical bent. You know, archaeologists don't believe in things unless they can break them, touch them, knock on them, taste them, something. It's science. Archaeology is a scientific discipline that interprets its findings through the humanities. It's a unique kind of field that way. So I tend to think that way anyway. But the other way I think is I am really a public heritage person. I have spent 30 years of my life interpreting, I hope, a really excellent kind of historical research, whether it be in archaeology or through documents or whatever, but a real level of excellence, really good research information in ways that ordinary people can understand. Some of the things that are written here, particularly about the Black history of Toronto, have never been written down before, at least not in this way. About what I've discovered about the community by working through tax records and census records and that sort of thing, seemingly dry, dusty government documents. But I've learned an awful lot about what life was like for ordinary people and refugees. These people were refugees. Now, not all of them were. Some of them were free Black people who came to this country because they wanted to build a better life for themselves and be safe. But their story, too, is there in those documents if you know where to look. All of that builds the story in a way that people will want to read it. When I speak to audiences where a lot of the people in the audience, their ancestors made their money in slavery. They were the descendants of slaveholders, and they're still to some extent living off the proceeds because that's how their families got their wealth. The thing that jars them most, and again, this is narrative and identity, an American sense of identity, and Canadian for that matter, because I talk to people here whose ancestors were slaveholders in Canada, which we don't think about all that often, but it's true, is that they have a sense of what the South that never was like, or what Canadian slavery was kinder and gentler, or all of these ideas that it wasn't really that bad. We have to think, too, about what slavery in Canada meant. Because we always feel so superior in the United States about the fact that they had slavery and we accepted the fugitive slaves. Well, let me tell you what it was like for people when they got here. I'm sure that when a man went to a mill with a bag of grain over his shoulder and they saw he was black, the price of milling the grain went up. I'm sure that when people tried to rent shops to start a business in downtown Toronto or Montreal or Halifax or Sarnia, places that had significant black communities, I'm sure that there were landlords that wouldn't rent to them. Whatever accomplishment black Canadians made in the years of the 19th century, they did that in spite of rampant racism. When you tell people how to feel about their own heritage, it is a tremendously political act. Public history is a political act. History has been used over and over again as a way of keeping people down. If you tell a group of people in a colonial situation that their heritage doesn't matter and the heritage of the colonizers is what is important, then you are using history, those people's history, as a means of denigrating them. It is a means of diminishing their sense of self. The benefit of research in general is to try and find out as much of what is close to the truth of what happened as possible. We will never know truth in history. I mean, historical interest changes with time, people's perception changes with time, historiographical trends change, the fashion of who gets to be the hero changes at a given time. So what I've always been trying to do with bringing out the stories of the Underground Railroad, bringing out the stories of fugitive slaves who came to Canada and helped build the nation as we know it today, the people who left those terrible circumstances and tried to make a new life for themselves and their children, is to change the way people perceive what the term fugitive slave means. It's not a terrified, ragged, it's somebody who came with skills and ability and helped to contribute to this society. What's more, I try and make sure that my American audiences understand what they lost. I'd like to add one thing, and this is what I said when I received the Governor General's Award. This is part of my speech at Rideau Hall on the 13th of December, 2007. I was accepting the Governor General's Award in the name of Thornton and Lucy Blackburn, and in honor of the 35,000 African Americans who came to Canada and brought skills and ingenuity and abilities and above all immense courage and stayed to help build the nation of Canada as we know it today.